Hello and good afternoon to you all. My name is Max Hollein. I'm the director of the Fine Arts Museums, and I want to welcome you all to this very special afternoon here at the Legion of Honor. I want to also thank all of you for coming to this event, for supporting us by coming and by giving your support to the institutions, and for participating in what will certainly be a very memorable discussion and also an opening that we are celebrating with this talk here today. We are, of course, extremely pleased to be opening the show Read My Pins, Stories from a Diplomat's Jewel Box, and it's a particular joy, of course, to have Secretary Albright here with us, who I will introduce in a moment. But I want to thank, of course, also the donors to the exhibition that we are opening here today, especially, of course, also Katie Albright and Jake Schatz and Dagmar Dolby, Ambassador James Hormel, Ambassador Eleni Kounalakis, Laura and Gary Lauder, Gillian Manus, Diane Morris, Diane Nelson and John Atwater, Barbara and Bernard Osher, and the Susie Tompkins Buell Fund. I have to say that this is a show that also speaks about the power of object. A pin being used in a way that it actually can deliver and trigger a message. Same as an artwork or an artifact can encapsulate a message and can also communicate that probably sometimes more than a lot of words can do. And I think that's also particularly fitting to have this show here at the Legion of Honor, to a certain extent a jewel box in its own right, and I think it's also an institution that also shows you the power and the quality of objects and what they can actually portray in a very special way. So the Read My Pins illustrates certainly also the power of Secretary Albright's diplomatic signature and how she has used this diversity of pins politically, but also with a lot of humor and especially also humanity. And I'm sure she's going to tell the story, but what is of course fascinating is that the whole idea of the pins, of the brooch, as a matter of diplomatic discourse, if you want to call it that way, started with no one else than Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi media, but I don't want to go further into that. So we are deeply honored to have Secretary Albright here, and given, of course, not only her long and esteemed role as a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and a U.S. Secretary of State. She is, of course, someone who has done many things. She has broken glass ceilings, she has transformed politics, and she has been really a great, and I can see this as someone from Austria or from Europe, she's been a great ambassador at large for the American people, and deeply admired all over the world. And she's, of course, also not only a great diplomat, an important politician, but also a wonderful woman. And she will be speaking with Tom DeCaigny, the Director of Cultural Affairs for the San Francisco Arts Commission. And he's not only a great friend of this institution, but also a long-time advocate for the role of the arts, for education and culture at the local, state, and also at national levels. So I would like to ask Secretary Albright and Tom DeCaigny to join me here on the stage. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. It's a great honor to have you here with us today, Madam Secretary. And it's an honor to be able to ask you some questions about this incredible show. We're just talking, it's on its 20th stop, so it's gotten a great tour, and it's a great honor to have it here in San Francisco. So thank you to the Fine Arts Museums for hosting it.
And I'm delighted to be here, and I wanted to thank Max for telling everybody who I am, because not everybody always knows. I do travel a lot, and not long ago I was coming back from China, and Chicago was the first port of entry, and I was there getting undressed for the security people and put my stuff on the conveyor belt, and the lady behind me said, "So where'd you get all those screw-top bottles?" And I said, "Well, I got them at the Container Store." And then, as I'm going through the magnetometer, the TSA guard looks at me and says, "Oh my God, it's you." He said, I'm from Bosnia, and we all love you in Bosnia, and if it weren't for you, there wouldn't be a Bosnia, and you're always welcome in Bosnia. And can I have my picture taken with you? So we have our picture taken, the line gets all screwed up. I go back to get my stuff, and the lady of the screw-top bottle says, so what exactly happened here? And I said, well, I used to be Secretary of State, and she said of Bosnia? So Max, thank you.
Well, we certainly all know who you are. Well, I think we just want to start, for those people who've yet to have the privilege of reading your book, maybe you could tell us a little bit about where this idea of wearing pins as a representation of your feelings in diplomatic strategy came from.
Well, first of all, I clearly love jewelry, and I had some pins. And then what happened was I went to the United Nations in February 1993, and it was after the Gulf War. And the ceasefire had been translated into sanctions resolutions, and I was what's known as an instructed ambassador. And my instructions were to make sure that the sanctions would stay on. So I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein constantly, and he deserved it. He'd invaded Kuwait. So after a while, there was a poem in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. So I had a snake pin, and I wore it whenever we talked about Iraq. And so if you've noticed, when the ambassadors come out of the meeting, the press is out there, and all of a sudden a camera zeroes in. A reporter says, why are you wearing that snake pin? And I said, because Saddam Hussein compared me to an unparalleled serpent. And then I thought, well, this is fun. So I went out and I bought a lot of costume jewelry that would depict what I thought we were going to do on any given day. I was the only woman on the Security Council. So on good days, I wore flowers and butterflies and balloons. And on bad days, spiders and various horrible animals. And if you remember, the first President Bush had said, read my lips, no new taxes. So when people said, what are we going to do today? I'd say, read my pins. And that is how it started. And they began to figure out what we were doing. So and it's clearly blossomed into something much larger. And I think I helped to bring back the costume jewelry industry.
Well, jewelry makers everywhere, thank you. So your parents were diplomats, and in the book you describe a moment when your mom received a ring, Tito's ring. Maybe you could tell the story about that ring and what it was like growing up the daughter of a diplomat and how it might have prepared you for your future.
Great. Well, so I'm not a born American. I was born in Czechoslovakia. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and we spent the war in England. He was with the government in exile. And so we were there all through the war, and then the war was over. We went back to Czechoslovakia briefly, and my father was made ambassador to Yugoslavia. And the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. So one of the things that happened was my father had signed an agreement along with the Romanians and Hungarians called the Little Entente, and they were having a meeting with Tito, and the wives were there, and all of a sudden, you have to put this into the context. This was immediately after the war. Yugoslavia was very poor, and all of a sudden, at the villa where Tito lived, my mother described this. This person came in a uniform, but he had a silver tray with 3 little boxes on it. And each one was a ring for the wife of who was signing the agreement, and with a birthstone. And my mother was born in May, so this ring has an emerald and 14 diamonds in it. And in this time that everybody was very poor, and my father said, where did this come from, when she brought it back? But anyway, I got Tito's ring when I got my PhD, and so that's the history of it, and it really is a diplomatic symbol. It's quite beautiful. I never had the guts to wear it because it started large, but that is Tito's ring. And what happened one time was Tito came to the embassy, and my mother was one of these people that was very hospitable, and always after fancy receptions, she would invite guests of honor back to the residence part of the embassy to eat a Czech delicacy, which were basically hot dogs. But, and so she wanted to do that with Tito, and Tito's tasters were very nervous about this, and so she actually cut one hot dog in half, took a bite of it, and then gave it to Tito. then Tito actually forgot the flowers that I had given him there. So we had a lot of stories with Tito, but his ring is the best one.
The first part of your book discusses your youth and when you attended Wellesley, married your husband, and became a young mother. You talk about the jewelry you received during this time period, which was mostly gifts at the time. Could you highlight a few pieces that came to you during that time in your life, and then talk about any style icons that influenced you?
Well, I clearly, one of the beautiful pieces that, well, first of all, my parents had given me as a wedding present, all this is in the show, is a garnet. Garnets are a Czech national stone. And this is an antique garnet necklace and a pin and some earrings that came with that, which was really beautiful. And I, at a certain stage, actually made a red velvet dress that was the same color as the garnets. I used to make my own clothes, and so that was one. Then I got a beautiful jade pin from my former husband's grandmother that was really beautiful. Loved to wear that. And then there is a pin there from my mother, which is a bunch of circles together that I loved very much, and it had come from her family. And then most people that age, we all wore, anybody that went to college. I went to college sometime between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. But most of us had very simple taste, and we had little circle pins, so that is there too. And then there was this custom, before you were engaged, you were pinned. And so I had my husband's fraternity pin. So those are the ones that I got early on.
Are any of those traditions carried on in your family today in terms of jewelry or other?
No, well, they like jewelry, but nobody likes pins. So that's one of the problems. And my granddaughter is here, and when she was 5, she said, "So who's getting all this stuff?"
I think you're going to have to duke it out with a few museum directors. In the book, I saw the phrase, "the mute eloquence of pins with attitude." What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that part of it is that they all have stories, and they kind of are a way to express feelings that may be either nice or unfriendly. And attitude is they really do have a personality, as far as I'm concerned, and have a way of not really being in your face, but if you ask about it, they do have stories that go on. So, for instance, and they all have some kind of foreign policy story. And by the way, the only reason to do any of this is that I love foreign policy. A lot of people find it boring, but I try to make foreign policy less foreign. So the pins allow me to tell foreign policy stories. So we have a lot of relationships with Russians then and now. So what happened was that we found that the Russians had been bugging the State Department not far from where my office was. And we found the man ultimately sitting outside listening. And we did what diplomats do, which is to do a démarche, which is to complain to the capital. But the next time I saw the Russian foreign minister, I wore a huge bug. That is attitude.
Well, maybe you could tell us what you're wearing now. What's the pin you have on today?
This actually, to continue the theme, this is an owl, and it was given to me by the Russian foreign minister that had been my counterpart when we were both out of office. And so I think that they always have messages. But I have to tell, people now know that when they want to give me a present, a pin is right up there. So I was out of office already, and I had actually been asked at the 60th anniversary of NATO to be in a group that was looking at the future of NATO. And so what happened was there was a new Secretary General, and then it was decided by the heads of state that that Secretary General needed a group of experts to advise on a new strategic concept for NATO. So every one of the 28 members of NATO named an expert, and I was named the American expert. And so then the new Secretary General decided that the group of experts would actually be composed of 12 countries, automatically irritating 16 countries, and made me chairman of it. So one of the things we did was to go to Moscow to talk, and the foreign minister that I really got along with well, Igor Ivanov, who'd given me this pin, had also given me a pin that's a knot. So I'm standing there talking to the current Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who had been the permanent representative at the UN when I was, and is very clever and funny man when he's not being nasty. And so what happened was he looks at the pin and he said, "What does your pin mean?" Because he had been at the UN when I was doing all this. And I said, "It's our bond." So then we sat down at the shiny table for talks, and he said, "I figured out what your pin is. It's James Bond." And I said, "No, it's not." And he said, "Well, then it's what you think of our pipelines." And I said, "No, it is a bond of friendship given to me by your predecessor." So it's a discussion that kind of goes on.
What other pins have you been wearing while they're out on exhibition? Do you have a reserve?
Well, what happened was I missed all the ones that are on because they are the fun ones and they have the great foreign policy stories. But I have a whole new collection. A lot of them I call my pity pins because people feel sorry for me that I don't have the ones that are in the show. And so I have been developing a new collection, but they don't have the great stories, and so sometimes I just make them up.
Well, I saw a lot of people waiting in line have been inspired by you with their pins, and I just have to take a moment to say that our collections team, the City of San Francisco, has a civic art collection, and we don't often get to show off our jewelry collection. So this is by a local San Francisco artist from 1962, Margaret DePata. So,
it's great. It's beautiful.
Thank you. So we don't get to show it off much, but this is your city-owned civic art collection at work here. I think we'd also like to know how you pursued your career juggling a full family life and the steps you took. What were your goals when you set out, and are there any pins that symbolize your balancing act of family and career?
Well, first of all, my career did not turn out the way I expected. I was going to be a journalist, and I had been one of the editors of my college paper, and then I married a journalist, and while he was in the Army, I worked in Missouri. I worked on a small newspaper. And then we moved back to Chicago, and he already had a job, and we were having dinner with his managing editor, and he looked at me, he said, "So what are you going to do, honey?" I said, "I'm going to work on a newspaper." And he said, "I don't think so. You can't work on the same paper as your husband because of labor regulations." And even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago at the time, he said, "And you wouldn't want to compete with your husband." I know what I'd say now. I know what other people might say. But at the time, I saluted and found a new life. So I went to work for Encyclopedia Britannica. That, for some of you younger people, is a book. And so what they used to do is to review a whole set of kinds of articles. And that year, they were redoing the geographical articles. And since I was a poli-sci major, they figured I was intelligent enough to read the articles and find the proper illustration. So I did that. And then the other part that was somewhat old-fashioned, newspapers used to have space at the bottom of their columns, and they needed factoids to fill them. So I looked a lot of things up, and I still remember things like ostriches are voiceless, according to Encyclopedia Britannica. So then I did that for a while, and then we moved to Long Island, and I was pregnant with twins. And by the way, it was life before sonograms, and I just kept getting fatter and fatter, and the doctors were meaner and meaner, and they said, "You can't eat so much." So I had some horrible diet drink called Metrocal, and I walked around Long Island all the time. And so on one of these walks, I found that Hofstra University was offering a Russian course for 8 hours a day for 8 weeks. And I had always wanted to take Russian, but because I'm Czech, first-year Russian at Wellesley would have been too easy, but I couldn't take second-year Russian because I didn't know the alphabet. So I thought, too bad I really can't take this course because my twins were due in August. And then one day I went to the doctor who kept wandering around my stomach and said, "I hear at least 2 heartbeats." And what happened was they were born premature, and I had to leave them in the hospital. So what I did was go and take Russian. And it really made me think that I wanted to go back to school and to go to graduate school. So what I did then was, after a year with them, we moved back to Washington, and I went to graduate school. And my graduate work took me so long. I started it when the twins were a year old. They were in junior high, and finally one of them said, "Mom, if you don't finish your paper, we're not going to finish ours." So after I finally got my PhD, I went to work for Ed Muskie in Congress as his chief legislative assistant. And then, because I've been one of these people that I have had an awful lot of good luck, my former professor at Columbia was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who then asked me to come to the White House. When he was first named, he called me up and he said, "Madeleine, maybe you've heard that I've been named National Security Advisor." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Can you find me a place to live?" And I said, "Geez, Big, I thought you were calling to offer me a job." And he said, "No, I'm calling to ask you to find me a place to live." But ultimately, he did offer me a job. So I was in the Carter White House. Then I went to teaching at Georgetown when that election was lost. And then I got to work for the Clinton administration. So I'm not a journalist, but things turned out pretty well.
Speaking of journalism, what are your thoughts about the state of journalism in the United States and its health towards our democracy?
Okay. Let me just say that, to put it into context, I have always been fascinated about the role of information and political change. And partially, it was my attempt to figure out how somebody who was married to a journalist but was interested in academic view of international relations, and I studied the evolution of communism when I was at Columbia. I wrote my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press in 1968 during the Prague Spring. I also wrote a book later about the role of the Solidarity Press in Poland. So I've been very interested in the role of the media in political change. And obviously now interested in the change in media, of the kind of media, and the whole role of social media, and what it has done politically. And one of the things, for instance, I'm chairman of the board of a great organization called the National Democratic Institute. We work abroad an awful lot and trying to explain American democracy to foreigners and telling them that compromise is not a four-letter word, and really spending a lot of time thinking about all of that, and having studied an awful lot about what happened in the Arab Spring. So I've come out to Silicon Valley often, and I stole this line from somebody, but it really describes what's going on, which is people are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments hear them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses. So there is no faith in institutions. And the question is, what is the role of the media in all of this? And there is the media that still comes through the major channels and the major newspapers, but then there are the cable channels, and then there is all the social media, which may or may not have accurate information on it. And part of what happens is that people listen to what they already agree with. So it's kind of an echo chamber. So you all should be very glad you don't live in Washington, because when I drive, I listen to right-wing radio, and I yell a lot and get very angry, and so someday I will be arrested. But I do think that people need to listen to what they don't agree with. And what has happened during this last period is I think people have only been into an echo chamber, and I do think that there is a whole, one of the things that I am trying to be very calm about is not to do a lot of blame placing at the moment until we sort out what really has happened. And I do think that the media needs to examine itself in terms of what role it, in its largest context, played during this election. Some social media, some what the foreign media has done, and some what the Russian propaganda has done, any number of different things that I think need to be analyzed from a kind of larger poli-sci look, and also to understand what role media does play in political change at this point.
Do you think social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter have an ethical obligation to monitoring fake news or untruthful news?
Well, I think it's part of the real paradox and ambiguity that we live in. And it's just something I think and talk about all the time, which is how do you balance privacy and censorship, or privacy and security, and what is the responsibility of which part of our society? And one of the things that I would like to see happen, because I'm a great believer in having public-private partnerships and having, I know people think commissions are a waste of time, they are not. I think of having a look where some members of social media meet with some people that are responsible for regulation, some in terms of where our government is on privacy. That is going to be a very huge discussion. And I hope that happens, because the question is, what is the real responsibility? I can argue it both ways, frankly, that it would be better if we didn't have false information, but how do you even decide what the false information is? And what are the criteria whereby those issues are measured? But it is definitely an issue, and I know it's very germane in terms of some of the discussion in the last couple of days.
Thank you. One of the pins in your collection represents the glass ceiling. I wonder if you can talk about your own experiences with glass ceilings in your career, and what role can men play as allies in advancing gender equity?
Well, first of all, let me say that I am the oldest, and with a father who really did believe that girls could do anything that boys did. And I went to a women's college where all the leadership roles were and I'd gone to a girls' high school, so I came out of a very different kind of setting. I've already described how I was called honey and did not follow the career that I thought I was going to, mostly, and I obeyed. I mean, there's no other way to discuss it. What was interesting was that I had worked, people often ask me, did I have a woman role model? Well, I could say Eleanor Roosevelt, but the bottom line is there were not a lot of role models, except my professors at Wellesley, but not a lot of public figures. And so there's no question that what happened was that I had to kind of develop a path for myself. I know people don't like it when women say they were lucky. I was lucky because I managed to get my credentials together just at the time that people were looking for the one woman that they wanted. And so I have to say that when I went to work for Ed Muskie, I was his chief legislative assistant, there weren't a lot of women that were in those particular roles. And so I was able to put a career together in that particular way. It never occurred to me that I could be Secretary of State. Not that I lacked ambition, but I'd never seen a woman Secretary of State. And what happened was I was not the first woman to be UN Ambassador to the United Nations. Jean Kirkpatrick had preceded me. But there were not a lot of women permanent representatives there. So, for instance, when I was to my residence, and I get there, at that time there were 183 countries in the UN. And I get there, and there's 6 other women out of all that. And the countries that had women reps were Kazakhstan, Canada, Philippines, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, Liechtenstein, and me. Because I was the American, I created a caucus. And so we called ourselves the G7. And what we did was, first of all, agree that we would always take each other's phone calls. Second, that we would do things together. So we lobbied. At that time, the War Crimes Tribunal was being created for the former Yugoslavia, and most of the crimes that had been committed against women. And so we lobbied for women judges, and we managed to do that. We did a lot of things together. There were men that complained that I took a phone call from Liechtenstein versus them, and I said, well, just have yourself replaced by a woman, and I will always take the phone call. But the bottom line is that there were not a lot of us. I created also a group of foreign ministers when I was one. And so now there are a lot more. So the question was, when my name came up to be secretary, the following thing happened. It was clear that Warren Christopher didn't want to stay for a second term. And I was a member of the cabinet and a part of what is known as the Principals Committee, the group that kind of sets up the material for the president to make a decision. And I was on TV quite a lot. So during the period, what we are now noticing, the period of great mentioning, my name was out there, and people said, well, a woman couldn't be Secretary of State because the Arabs would not deal with a woman. And so what happened was the Arab ambassadors at the UN got together and put out a statement and said, we've had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We would have no problems dealing with Secretary Albright. So that went away. And then somebody at the White House, and I never want to know who, said, yeah, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. And so apparently, and I know this now, because I would not have been Secretary of State if it hadn't been for Hillary Clinton. And the reason I know that is President Clinton said so publicly when we were traveling abroad once. So what happened was I would introduce her, she would introduce him, and he said that during this period of the great mentioning, she would go to him and say, why wouldn't you name Madeleine? She is more in tune with your views than anybody else, expresses them better than anybody else, and besides, it would make your mother happy. So that is how it happened. But there really was a question as to whether women could be Secretary of State. When I walked into my office after being confirmed, the 7th floor of the State Department has this mahogany hall with the portraits of all the Secretaries of State. And they all only differed from each other as to whether they were clean-shaven or had beards. And I thought to myself, when my portrait goes up, the walls will shake a bit. And they did. And so Ellie, again my granddaughter, 7 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. And now there are a lot of little boys that look and John Kerry and think, well, maybe they could be Secretary of State. Yeah. By the way, in terms of life's coincidences, what happened was my father was a professor at the University of Denver. When we came to the United States, as my father defected and asked for political asylum, and at that stage, the Rockefeller Foundation was finding jobs for Central European intellectuals, and they found him a job at the University of Denver, and we had no idea where Denver was. And anyway, ultimately, he died in 1977. He was a pretty big deal in Denver at the time. So there were lots of flowers and tributes and things. And among them was this ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with a lot of leaves in it. And I said to my mother, where did this come from? And she said, it's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice. She had gone to the University of Denver. Her parents were associated with DU. She was a music major, hence the piano. And she took an international relations course from my father, and he persuaded her to be an international relations major. She got her master's at Notre Dame and was back writing her PhD with my father when he died. So this African-American music major from Alabama wrote her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. So in 1987, when I was helping Michael Dukakis, and my job was to find foreign policy advisors, I thought, why not call Dr. Rice, who, woman teaching on the West Coast, a Soviet expert. So I got on the phone, explained what I was doing, and she said, Madeleine, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father. So, you know. So this diplomat refugee basically trained 2 women secretaries of state. Yeah.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
We now have some questions from the audience here, from everybody out here. This next question is, now that the elections are over, what do you have to say to American women, and what can we do collectively to better our country and the world?
Well, I think that clearly women are not a monolithic group. And I think people really, it's hard to sort out the vote and why people voted the way they did. I think that is something that is going to be something that also has to be studied in terms of the media. And I do think that we have to figure out what really did happen in terms of whether, I don't have to say whether, there definitely is sexism, and what the reasons for it are. And then I do think that we need to respect each other's views, but try to figure out how to get more women into politics. I forgot to answer one part of your previous question, what can men do? I do actually believe in a co-ed life, and I think men and women can help each other in terms of leadership roles. There are a lot of people who think the world would be better off if it were run only by women. If you think that, you've forgotten high school. You know, so I think that it is important to kind of have a mix and try to figure out people that have views that you can support. And I have said for a very, very long time that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. But it did not have anything to do with, and it really does come, to go back to my story, it comes from my own story, because during this period when I was going to school and doing all those different things, the part that I found hardest were other women who were very critical. And some of them would say, why are you in the library when you should be picking your children up at school or spending time with them? And besides, my hollandaise sauce is so much better than yours. And so there really was kind of putting me down for what I was doing, and not at all helpful in that. So they're the women that I think we project our own weaknesses onto other women. Every woman's middle name is guilt, because you're never quite in the right place. And I think people, working moms, criticize those that are at home and vice versa, and we don't respect each other enough. And then there are the issues about the queen bee who says if there's only one job, it's mine. And I think that meetings are much better off when there are more women in them. And so what I would say is, and there are women I would never vote for, so the bottom line is, it is more supporting each other in the choices that we make, respecting each other's choices, and then being supportive and working with men to make a better world.
What do you consider your most crowning achievement that changed or potentially changed the American international course of our history?
Well, nothing, but whatever. No, let me just say, the thing that I'm proudest of really is the following, and it goes back to the Bosnia business. What happened, because my life really is a series of very peculiar coincidences. The fact that my father had been ambassador to Yugoslavia, and that I spent a large portion of my time at the UN and as secretary dealing with the Balkans, is kind of a strange coincidence. And my father wrote about Yugoslavia. I understand Serbian and Croatian, and I'd gone there to visit. And so all of a sudden, everything is about the Balkans. And in Bosnia, to do with Bosnia, what happened was that when President Clinton was candidate Clinton, he had said we'd do something about Bosnia right away. And then he got into office, and it was the economy stupid, and then he had problems with the military in terms of don't ask, don't tell, a number of different issues. And he didn't get to Bosnia right away. And so he was criticized for it, and it took us a while to get there. And I thought we needed to do something earlier. So when I was secretary and Kosovo was a problem, and there was ethnic cleansing going on, I thought, now I am secretary and we are going to do something. And what happened, and it's actually a good case study in terms of the Secretary of State can say anything about how force and diplomacy go together, but the State Department has no airplanes. And so the question was first how to persuade our own government to do something. So it was very interesting in terms of persuading Secretary Cohen and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But President Clinton agreed with what I was doing, and we actually then did use air power to end the ethnic cleansing. So domestically it was interesting, and then internationally it was interesting because we wanted a UN mandate. But as a result of my friendships with the Russians, I was in Moscow trying to figure out whether they would veto whatever we did if we brought it to the United Nations. And it was clear that they were going to veto it. So then we had to get NATO to do this. And NATO had gone to war. We managed to make that happen. And so what did happen was that it was interesting domestically and internationally. Now the problem was the war starts, and the weather was bad, and the Serbs put out decoys, and I walk into my office a few days into the war, and my executive assistant said, "Sit down." I said, "What?" He said, "Just sit down." I said, "What is the matter with you?" And he said, "We've just bombed the Chinese embassy by mistake." And so everything was going wrong, at which point they called it Madeleine's War. Then when we won, they called it something else. But the bottom line is that now, when I go to Kosovo, there is a whole generation of little girls whose first name is Madeleine. And we did make a difference there. And it's an independent country. And while there's still a long way to go, I think it did make a difference.
Thank you. This next question is, how is the internet and social media affecting the work of the Department of State overseas?
Well, in a very big way. I'll tell you what is interesting is, obviously, diplomatic communications have always been a question and an issue. And I do teach now, and it's fun to kind of think about how that has all changed. I think that many of you have read David McCullough's books in terms about John Adams, et cetera. He goes abroad and negotiates a bunch of treaties. Nobody hears from him until he comes home, and very few instructions. What happens is ambassadors operate under instructions from Washington, and most of it comes through cable traffic, or did. And it takes a while to get back and forth. But all of a sudden, the information revolution has changed everything. So even when I was there, and by the way, we had Wang computers when I was there, when things were really going on, in the operations center, people were watching CNN because it was very hard to get information back and forth as quickly as possible. Now the information is so rapid that theoretically one is required to make decisions quickly. And one of the things I tell my students is, or we have a whole bunch of Madeleine's verities that I tell my students, but one of them is the first information that comes in is usually wrong. And so the question is, and then the media wants an immediate answer. And if you say no comment, then they think you're, not leveling with them. And it has changed things in terms of the need for the rapidity of decisions. And the whole decision-making process gets much more complicated. And the other part that I think people don't fully understand yet, and again, the course I teach, by the way, I'm at Georgetown, and I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And the course I teach is called the National Security Toolbox. And there are not a lot of tools in there. There's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. There are the economic tools, the carrots, which are trade and aid, and the sticks, which are sanctions. There's a threat of the use of force, law enforcement, and intelligence. That's it. The issue is that the State Department is not the only decision maker. Every department in the US government has something to do with foreign policy. And so the issue then becomes, how does the interagency process work? How much control does the White House have? Where does the information come in? Is the first information accurate? And then one of the issues that I think people forget, intelligence created by the intelligence agencies is a product, and the decision maker is the consumer. And I can guarantee you that the intelligence that one reads is never black and white. It does a lot of scenarios, and different people see different things in the intelligence. And so the decision making is much harder, and it used to be there was not enough information, and now there's too much, and the question is whether it's accurate or not. So it has changed everything.
So switching gears back to pins, did you, which is a swing. Did you make any pins yourself, or have you had any pins commissioned?
I haven't made any pins myself, but often what has happened, people ask me what my favorite pin is. My favorite pin is Katie's heart. And Katie made a ceramic pin for me, and people say, how old is Katie? I won't say how old she is now, but she has been various ages, 20, 25, et cetera, and she always says, Mom, you have to tell him I made the pin when I was 5. So that is my favorite pin. And when it's in the show now, So what happened, because I used to love to wear it, Ellie made me some little hearts that I like. I haven't made any pins myself, but what happened was there was a show at the Museum of Art and Design initially where they commissioned a series of pins in my honor. And the only one I have is the one that is in the show, which is of the Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty's eyes are clocks. And they're done in a way so that I could look down to see what time it was during a meeting, but it also, the person sitting across from me was able to see what time it was. The only problem is the clocks are pretty small and you could just kind of see people peering at it. So people have done things on my behalf, but I am not talented enough to make my own pins. I just make the decisions about which ones are appropriate for what day.
Have you ever been asked to remove a pin, and if so, which one and why?
No, only by TSA. Yeah. No, I actually haven't, but it probably will come up next.
This next question, will you be attending the inauguration, and if so, what pin will you be wearing?
I am sure I will not be attending the inauguration, but basically I think I would keep wearing a question mark because I think we are unclear about whom we have elected.
Well, that's a fitting transition to our last question from the audience. Given your experience, what do you think our country's future looks like?
Well, I am a very grateful American and an optimist who worries a lot. I think that our future is good. I really do think, because we are an amazing country. We are great. And our diversity is what I think has made us great. And I think that what is going to be very important is for us to recognize that our diversity is what has made the difference. And let me just say this to kind of put this back to the story. When, as I described, we spent the war in England, and we were refugees there. And then we left there, went back to Czechoslovakia, then to Yugoslavia, then the communists took over. My father came to the United States, as I said, defected and asked for political asylum. And what he used to say on a regular basis, that when we were in Europe, people would say, "We're so sorry that your country's been taken over by Hitler. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you, and when are you going home?" When we came to the United States, people said, "We're so sorry, your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you, and when will you become a citizen?" And my father said, that is what makes America different. And one of the things that I love to do is to go to naturalization ceremonies. I've renewed my own vows several times, but also I can't swear people in because I'm not an officer of the court, but I can give people their naturalization certificates. And the first time I did it was on July 4th, 2000 at Monticello, since I had Thomas Jefferson's job. And as I gave people their naturalization certificate, I said, "I have exactly the same piece of paper. It is the most valuable paper you will ever get. Keep it safe." And then I heard somebody saying, "Can you believe that a refugee got their naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State?" And I said, "Can you believe that a refugee is the Secretary of State?" And that is what makes this country different. I did this just a few weeks ago at the National Archives, where I gave people their naturalization certificate. And I think this country is enriched by those who come here and want to be citizens and do it in a way that respect the laws of our country. And I think that we need to remember that and cherish our diversity, and we do have a great future ahead of us.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice.
Well, Thank you so much for visiting us in San Francisco and lending us your brooches for a viewing. So for those of you that haven't seen, please be sure to check out the exhibition. And after we adjourn here, we are going to be going upstairs for a book signing and a reception. But before we all leave, I just want to see, do you have any final words you'd like to share with
Let me
us?
just say, Tom, thank you very much for your questions, and I thank the audience for yours. And thank you all so much for being so gracious, and I hope you enjoy the show. It does have some fun aspects to it and some serious ones, and I am delighted to be in San Francisco. It's a fantastic place, and culturally in every way, and I'm so honored to be in the Legion of Honor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.